It's good to see everyone out tonight. And I got a lot of stuff to go through, so I'm going to keep the introduction side of it brief. It's August 1942. This would be right in the middle of what we would know as World War II. And this would be at the height of what would be considered the North Africa campaign of that war. The two forces, the Axis and the Allies, have been contentiously fighting for many months and years at this point. The Axis forces have just heavily pushed the British forces back to a little small town known as El Alamein. Now, there's already been one battle here, the first battle of El Alamein, but that ended in a stalemate. No one was able to gain any ground. And so there was no progress on either side, no real victory. The commander of the British Army, the one who had been commanding the Middle Eastern forces and was the commander of the 8th Army of the British forces, he was out. And so there's this stark line drawn in between these oppressive forces. The Axis had just been sweeping across them, and the British needed something. They needed something to fight back. They needed to push back and get their ground back. And so with this commander, who was named Sir Claude Auchinleck, whenever he was moved out, they had to replace his two roles with two other people. The command of the Middle East was given to someone else, but I'd like to focus on the person who ended up becoming the commander of the 8th Army. The 8th Army is the one that was actually positioned right at El Alamein. The commander, his name was Bernard Montgomery. He had a pretty big task. He had to push back the Axis not only from El Alamein, but he had to get them all the way back from where they were. He had to push back and get back to Mersa Matra and to Sidi Barrani. He had to get them all the way back there under Churchill's orders. And the British forces were tired. So he had an important job. He had to rally his troops. He had to get them going. And so on August 13th, he gave a speech. I'm not going to go through the entire speech because that would take us all night and that would get rid of my invitation entirely. But I want to focus on one phrase in particular. He says, "Here we will stand and fight. Here we will stand and fight. There will be no further withdrawal. I've ordered that all plans and instructions dealing with a further withdrawal are to be burnt, and at once. We will stand and fight here. If we can't stay here alive, then let us stay here dead." These British forces were completely exhausted after these many months of having to fight back against this constantly progressing Axis force. They weren't having a single victory. And so he was saying, this is where we are going to hold the line. Why am I saying all this? We as Christians need to make sure we're holding the line every day. The world's pushing hard against us. We need to be ready to hold the line. So I have 6 passages, and I promise I'll go through them quickly. But 6 passages as kind of God's rally cry to us, God's instructions to his troops that may be waning. Isaiah chapter 55, verses 10 and 11 says, "For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return there without watering the earth, and making it bear and sprout, and furnishing seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so will my word be which goes forth from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, without accomplishing what I desire, and without succeeding in the matter for which I sent it." First thing we need to know is that God's plan always wins. It doesn't matter what it is that's going against it. God's plan will always succeed. And so we need to know, what are our orders? We're given 2 big orders. One is to spread the gospel. We see that in Matthew chapter 28, verse 18 through 20. And 2, we're told to remain faithful. We'll get to that passage later. So spread the gospel and remain faithful. And if we're doing those 2 things, God's plan will succeed. No plan of man can stop God's plan. That's the main thing that we need to remember at this point. 2 Kings chapter 6 in verse 16 and 17. "So he answered, 'Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them.' Then Elisha prayed and said, 'O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see.' The Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha." What was going on there is that Elisha and his servant were in this kind of secluded town, and this large army had surrounded them. And the servant was very panicked. It's like, "We're going to die. There's no chance out of this. We're dead. Look at that army." And Elisha says, hold on. Change your perspective. Look at what God's army is doing for us. God's army is always beside us. We may be out there in the world and we may be feeling alone, And there may be moments where we are physically alone, but we are never spiritually alone. God is always by our side, and God's army is always ready to back us up. So never forget that God's plan will always succeed, and you're never alone in this. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10 and 20, I'm not going to read that one. That one's a longer passage, but we know that this is about the armor of God. It may be easy to kind of droop our heads and kind of get a little bit low whenever we're losing the battle. We may feel all down and we won't want to do anything. What does Paul tell us right there? He keeps on telling us to put on our armor. Why are we having to put on our armor? Putting on your armor is for someone who's about to go to battle and who's about to fight. We're always having to fight. We can't have a moment to droop our heads and just sit back and be like, oh, well, the world's going to take their turn and then we're going to take ours. No, we're fighting every day. God's army is always marching forward. His truth is always marching on. Joshua chapter 1 and verse 9 is the next place I'd like to go to. He says, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not tremble or be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. There's a famous general that I'm almost certain everyone has heard about, Alexander the Great. He was very well known for the fact that he never lost a battle. Why did he never lose a battle? Well, obviously, he was a pretty smart dude. But there was one thing that was mentioned about Alexander the Great, which I think heavily benefited the reason why he never lost. He was the one who was at the front of the army. He was not the sitting back on the back line general just making out the plans and sending the guys out to do it themselves. He was the one who'd be like, all right, let's go. And he would go ride first. We need to remember, God's doing the same exact thing. God is our frontline commander. He is not on the back. He is on the front. We're following his command, and he's going to lead the first charge. So never forget that. Whenever we're charging into unknown territory, remember God's charging in there first for us. He knows what it's going to be like, and he's going to lead us through it. So never be afraid of what's going to happen in that regard. God is taking the first step. It's our job to follow. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which clings so closely to us. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Just like the Allied forces were kind of pincered in, and they didn't have much place to go. It's kind of hard to keep fighting whenever you don't have your objective. But we need to remember two things. One is that we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, and those people are telling us that we can do it because they've done it as well. We look to their example, but we also look to our target. You'll always miss a target if you're not looking at it. We need to look at our target being Jesus. If we look to our target, we'll win. We'll make it through because God's going to lead us and we're going to go toward that target of Jesus. Final passage, Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10. It says, do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison so that you will be tested. And you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you a crown of life. I know this feels like I'm going pretty fast, but there's a lot of passages to cover. There's a lot that I'd like to say about it. But I want to make sure that this point gets emphasized. The people who retreat are not going to win the war. The people who keep on running away from the battle are not going to win. It's the ones who stand and fight. It's the ones who keep their faith whenever it comes to our spiritual war. Those who give up their faith for the fact that it's too hard aren't the ones who are going to win that crown. It's the ones who stand and keep their ground. They're the ones who will get that crown. They're the ones who will be the victors. "17 days after Bernard Montgomery gave this speech, there was a battle known as the Battle of Alem el-Halfa. This was the last major offensive that the Axis forces were able to have in the North Africa campaign. The reason why it was the last one is because the British stopped them right there. They had been pincered around. The Axis had swooped around to the other side, but they did not give up their ground. They fought to the last man, and they did not lose because they kept fighting. After that, the British went on to push the Axis all the way back. There was no stopping them beyond that. The Second Battle of El Alamein, British victory. And they kept going, and they pushed them all the way back. We need to be ready to do the same. God is leading us. His plan will not fail. And we can't retreat. We have to keep pushing forward. We have to stay with God. If you feel like the world is getting you down, the world is trying to make sure that you stop. If they can get you to stop, then they win. So I want to emphasize the point that God is giving you this rally cry tonight to say, you're not done yet. Keep fighting. I'm with you, and I will fight with you. And so for those who aren't part of the army of God tonight, those who haven't been baptized into the name of Christ, those who haven't gone to do all the steps that are necessary to become a child of God, tonight's the night. Enlist into God's army and be ready to fight. And for those of us who are waning in our spirit and need to be brought back, those of us who wanted to retreat before but now realize that we need to come back into the army of God, God is ready to help, and we're ready to help you as well. If you have any need to make your life right tonight, please come forward as we stand and sing.